The general who lost an empire, how Burgoyne's arrogance shattered Britain's invasion plan. But here is what history forgot to tell you. Burgoyne's catastrophic defeat at Saratoga in 1777 was not the result of his arrogance alone. It was the direct consequence of three men who should have stopped him, who had the power to stop him, and who chose not to. By the end of this video, I am going to show you the names of those men, the exact moment each of them failed to act, and how one small decision, one single instance of courage that never happened, would have changed everything. Stay with me, because this secret has been buried in footnotes for 246 years. If you're watching this channel, you know that American military history is full of stories we never heard in school. The men who turned the tide, the commanders who made impossible decisions, and sometimes, the leaders who should have been stopped before they threw away thousands of lives. If you have a story like that in your own family or community, drop it in the comments below. And if you want to understand the patterns of how empires make these kinds of choices, the hidden signals, the pressure points, the psychological machinery behind decisions like this one, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. You are about to see something most people miss entirely about this campaign. Wait, this part is important. Before we go any further, you need to know that we have created a complete in-depth guide to the American Revolutionary War's pivotal moments and the decision-making patterns that shape them. This is not something you find in mainstream history textbooks. It is a detailed breakdown of the psychological and political mechanisms that led generals, politicians, and commanders to make choices that cost thousands of lives. That guide is available in the description below and pinned in the comments. It is a paid resource, but it contains the frameworks and the primary source analysis that makes what you are about to hear click into place. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, the story that everyone knows goes like this. In 1777, British General John Burgoyne, a charming, ambitious officer, convinced King George III and his war cabinet that a single campaign could end the American Revolution. His plan was elegant. 3 British columns would converge on Albany, New York, one marching south from Canada along the Hudson River, another pushing north from New York City, under General William Howe, and a third striking east through the Mohawk Valley. When they met at Albany, the Hudson Corridor would be cut in two. New England would be isolated. The rebellion would be starved of supplies, communication, and reinforcements. The revolution would collapse. Burgoyne was not some obscure tactician. He was 54 years old, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, a member of Parliament, and a man who moved in London's highest circles. Soldiers called him Gentleman Johnny because he refused to live like a common soldier in the field. He traveled with a personal wine merchant, multiple uniforms, writing desks, and his mistress. He was charming, articulate, and absolutely certain he was a genius. He had convinced the king himself. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. By October of that year, Burgoyne stood in a muddy field near Saratoga, New York, and surrendered nearly 6,000 of the finest soldiers the British Empire possessed. It was the worst British military defeat of the entire war. It changed everything. Within 4 months of that surrender, France, which had been watching from the sidelines, saw that the Americans could actually defeat a professional European army. France signed a formal alliance with the United States. Spanish ships began attacking British convoys. The American Revolution transformed overnight from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict that would drain Britain's treasury for years. The history books blame Burgoyne's character, his ego, his overconfidence, his refusal to listen to warnings. They are not wrong. But that is the surface layer. The deeper truth is this. Burgoyne should never have been given command of this campaign in the first place, and the men responsible for giving it to him, men with the authority and the foresight to stop it, made deliberate choices not to. These were not simple mistakes or oversights. They were political calculations, instances of deference to a charismatic man, and moments where the safer choice was to say nothing and let someone else bear the responsibility. One of those men was Lord George Germain, Secretary of State for America. Germain was 60 years old, experienced, and held one of the most powerful positions in the British government. He was responsible for approving the entire plan. The other was General William Howe, who was already in New York commanding the main British force. Howe was supposed to march north and meet Burgoyne at Albany. The third was Admiral Lord Sandwich, the First Lord of the Admiralty, who controlled naval resources and supply lines. All three men had the ability and the responsibility to recognize that the plan as Burgoyne presented it was incomplete, dangerous, and built on assumptions that could not possibly hold up under the pressure of an actual campaign against a determined enemy. But none of them did. The conversation between Burgoyne and Germain took place in London during the winter of 1776 and early 1777. Burgoyne walked into the office of the Secretary of State with a proposal that was both ambitious and intoxicating to a man who wanted the American rebellion to end. Burgoyne laid out his 3-column strategy. He spoke with confidence. He had the ear of the king. He had fought in major wars before. He carried himself like a man who had already won before the bullets started flying. Germain listened, and then, instead of pressing for details, instead of demanding to know what contingencies existed, what would happen if Howe did not march north on schedule, what the supply lines looked like, what Indian allies would actually contribute, whether Burgoyne had the flexibility to adapt if the enemy did not cooperate with his timeline, Germain approved it. Enthusiasm replaced scrutiny. The Secretary of State of the British Empire said yes to a general's dream without asking the hard questions that his office demanded he ask. Hold on, this is where the decision tree fractures. Because once Germain approved the plan, he sent it to General William Howe in New York with an expectation that Howe would coordinate his northern march with Burgoyne's southern advance. This was not a formal order. It was a recommendation sent across the Atlantic with the assumption that Howe would understand the strategic necessity and act accordingly. But Howe was already committed to his own campaign. He wanted to take Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress. He wanted a victory that would carry his name, destroy Washington's main army, and demonstrate British superiority in the center of the colonies. He read Germain's message about supporting Burgoyne's advance, and instead of adjusting his own plans, he essentially ignored it. This is not speculation. Howe's own letters from that period show a man focused entirely on Philadelphia. He mentions Burgoyne's campaign almost as an afterthought. When Germain's letter arrived suggesting that Howe should move north to meet Burgoyne at Albany, Howe did not refuse directly. He simply continued with his own plans and left the coordination to chance. It was a catastrophic failure of command unity, and Germain, sitting in London, did nothing to correct it. The supply situation was equally fragile, and this is where Admiral Sandwich comes into the story. The Navy controlled transport ships, supply vessels, and the protection of convoys moving north and south. Burgoyne's army would need consistent resupply as it moved through the wilderness of upstate New York. It was a long march through hostile territory with limited roads and thick forests. An army cannot move on hope and confidence. It needs food, ammunition, replacement muskets, medicines, and the ability to carry wounded men. Sandwich knew this. Every First Lord of the Admiralty knows this. It is the foundation of military logistics. But when Sandwich was asked about supporting Burgoyne's campaign, he did not commit the resources fully. He did not position supply vessels at strategic points along the Hudson. He did not arrange for transport ships to move supplies north from New York City to support the advancing army. Instead, naval resources were spread thin across multiple theaters, maintaining the blockade of American ports, protecting merchant vessels, supporting Howe's operations around New York and Philadelphia. Burgoyne's supply line was treated as secondary, an assumption that it would somehow work out, that the army would live off captured resources, that the urgency would not be as great as it sounded in theory. This was not negligence. This was a choice. A choice made by powerful men who saw a problem, recognized a risk, and decided that saying nothing was safer than challenging a general who had the king's ear. Burgoyne was confident. Burgoyne was charming. Burgoyne was convinced of his own genius. And in the hierarchies of the British military and government, that confidence carries weight. Men like Germain, Howe, and Sandwich were all senior officers, all experienced, all capable of understanding the risks. But they lived in a world where a man who questioned a peer too loudly could find his career damaged, his reputation questioned, his judgment doubted by the men who controlled promotions and honors. So they did not question, they deferred. They assumed Burgoyne knew what he was doing. They believed that a general with the king's approval must have thought everything through, and they were catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. Burgoyne left London in the spring of 1777 with approximately 7,800 soldiers under his command. He had German mercenaries, British regulars, Canadian militia, and Indian allies. On paper, it was a formidable force. But the moment he arrived in Canada and began assembling his army for the march south, the assumptions that had looked so elegant in London started to crack. The Indians who were supposed to contribute hundreds of warriors to his cause were far fewer than promised. Perhaps only 200 to 300 showed up. The Canadian militia were reluctant, many deserting before the campaign even began. The supply situation was immediately worse than anticipated. The wilderness was more difficult to traverse than the map suggested, and most critically, the Americans were not cooperating with Burgoyne's timeline. By the time Burgoyne realized the plan was beginning to fail, that Howe was not marching north to meet him at Albany, that his supply lines were stretched to their absolute limit, that American resistance was far more organized and capable than he had expected, it was too late. He had committed to the advance. He could not retreat without losing credibility. He could not stay in place without stalling an offensive that was supposed to move with speed. And the Americans, under General Horatio Gates and with the tactical brilliance of Benedict Arnold commanding in the field, were concentrating their forces directly in his path. The battles at Saratoga, actually a series of engagements over several weeks in September and October, revealed the depths of Burgoyne's miscalculation. He was fighting an enemy that was willing to trade ground for time, that was willing to absorb casualties to bleed his supply lines further, that had interior lines of communication and supply while he had a single, vulnerable line of support stretching back through Canadian wilderness. Every battle weakened him. Every delay meant more desertions, more supplies consumed, more ammunition expended with nothing gained. By October 17, 1777, Burgoyne had surrendered his entire army. Nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers, the cream of the Empire's military force, became prisoners of war. But this is where the story becomes about something larger than one general's failure. This is where the consequences of Germain, Howe, and Sandwich's passivity, their unwillingness to challenge Burgoyne directly, their deference to a confident man speaking with the king's approval, this is where all of that became visible to the entire world. And France was watching, Spain was watching, the Dutch were watching. The moment Burgoyne surrendered, every power in Europe reevaluated the American Revolution. If the British could lose an entire army like this, if their strategic planning was this flawed, if their coordination between commanders was this broken, then the Americans had a real chance of winning. The news reached Versailles in late November of 1777. King Louis XVI and his foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, had been waiting for a sign, any sign, that the British Empire could bleed. Burgoyne's surrender was that sign. Within weeks, France committed its entire navy, its treasury, and thousands of soldiers to the American cause. That single capitulation in the Hudson Valley transformed a colonial rebellion into a world war. Britain now faced enemies on every ocean. Their resources, stretched across a global empire, began to fray. This is the moment that historians often gloss over in a single paragraph, but it deserves to be understood in its full weight. Before Saratoga, that is what the American victory came to be called, the French crown was cautious. King Louis had advisors warning him that backing a rebellion was risky, that the Americans might collapse, that French gold and French soldiers might be spent for nothing. Vergennes himself had drafted multiple contingency plans. France was ready to help, but only if the Americans proved they could sustain a real war effort. Burgoyne's defeat changed that calculation entirely. It proved that the British army was not invincible. It proved that American commanders could execute a complex campaign against professional soldiers and win. It proved that investing in American independence was not throwing money into an empty well. Within 6 months of Saratoga, the formal treaty of alliance between France and the United States was signed and ratified. French ships began arriving in American ports. French officers, including the young Marquis de Lafayette, were already crossing the Atlantic to volunteer. French gold began flowing into the continental treasury. By the time Burgoyne was marching into captivity, the outcome of the war had already been decided. The British had lost not just a battle or even a single army. They had lost the entire war's political strategy. And Burgoyne himself? His humiliation was not finished when he handed over his sword. The articles of capitulation that Burgoyne signed, the agreement by which his army would be allowed to march out with their weapons and return to Britain under parole, became a source of endless dispute. American commanders argued that Burgoyne had violated the terms by trying to smuggle messages out to British forces still in New York, warning them of the American strength. Congress refused to ratify the agreement. For years after the surrender, Burgoyne remained a prisoner, held in comfortable captivity, but utterly disgraced in the eyes of his own government. When he was finally exchanged and allowed to return to London in 1778, his arrival was met not with ceremony, but with fury. Parliament demanded answers. King George III, who had blessed the campaign with such enthusiasm, turned cold. The court that had celebrated Burgoyne's brilliant strategy now treated him as a cautionary tale. He was stripped of his position as lieutenant general. His military career, for all intents and purposes, was finished. He tried to rehabilitate himself through writing, through his connections in Parliament, through his friendships with people in power, but the stain never fully lifted. What made Burgoyne's fall even more complete was that he understood, on some level, what had happened to him. In his later writings and in the letters he left behind, there are moments of clarity where he acknowledges his own responsibility. He had trusted his own reputation too much. He had assumed that his charm and his connections at court would compensate for any setback in the field. He had believed that the revolution was something to be managed by a confident officer, not something that required the full coordination of an empire's military strategy. Before we continue with what happened to the survivors of his army and the long shadow Saratoga cast over the rest of the war, I need to take a moment and explain something that is crucial to understanding not just Burgoyne, but the entire British command structure that enabled him to fail so catastrophically. The in-depth guide to British military strategy during the Revolutionary War, the organizational failures, the communication breakdowns, the culture of deference that allowed one man's confidence to override collective judgment, all of that is explored in complete detail in our ebook, available in the description and pinned comment. That guide breaks down the mechanisms of how empires lose wars, not because their soldiers lack courage, but because their leadership lacks the humility to listen to contradicting voices. If you want to understand the patterns that led to Saratoga and the many similar collapses of strategic planning throughout military history, that ebook is where those patterns are fully decoded. The soldiers under Burgoyne's command paid the price for his arrogance. Many of them were German, mercenaries hired by Britain from the Principality of Hesse-Kassel. They had no quarrel with America. They had been sent across an ocean to fight in a war they did not understand, in a wilderness that made no sense to European military minds trained in the open battlefields of the continent. These men were professionals. They were disciplined. They were brave. But they were also far from home, far from supplies, and increasingly aware that they were being led by a man whose strategy was unraveling in real time. The surrender at Saratoga was devastating for the common soldiers, because they had nowhere to go. American forces did not have the capacity to hold 6,000 prisoners. The agreement that was supposed to allow them to march back to New York and eventually return to Europe fell apart in political recrimination. Instead, many were marched to prisoner camps in Virginia and Massachusetts, where they remained for years. Conditions were often brutal. Disease was rampant. Many died never knowing why they had been brought to this distant colony to die in captivity. The American soldiers who defeated Burgoyne, by contrast, received a gift that would alter the course of the entire war. They had proven something fundamental, that discipline, intelligence, and superior positioning could overcome the reputation and professional training of the British Army. That confidence spread through the Continental Army like wildfire. If Saratoga could be won, then other battles could be won. If one British general could be defeated, then others could be defeated. The psychological shift was as important as the military one. General Horatio Gates, the American commander who orchestrated the victory at Saratoga, became a national hero overnight. His face was celebrated in newspapers. Congress voted him a medal. He was offered a position as a senior strategist at the Continental Congress. There was serious talk of making him the supreme commander of all American forces, a position that would have displaced George Washington. Gates was a careful, methodical commander who understood supply lines and logistics in a way that Washington, for all his strategic brilliance, sometimes struggled with. But Gates also had ambitions. He had political connections. He saw in the victory at Saratoga not just a military triumph, but a path to power within the revolutionary leadership. Washington watched this carefully. He was not a man prone to jealousy, but he was also not naive about how power worked in a revolutionary government. He understood that Gates's victory, while genuine, had benefited from circumstances and from the aggressive mistakes of Burgoyne. He understood that if Congress became convinced that Gates was the superior general, Washington's own authority could be undermined. But Washington did something that Burgoyne had been incapable of doing. He swallowed his pride. He congratulated Gates. He asked for detailed reports of the campaign so he could learn from it. He positioned himself as a student of success rather than a competitor threatened by it. This was the quality that ultimately made Washington indispensable and Burgoyne utterly disposable. The contrast between these two commanders becomes sharper the more you examine it. Burgoyne had traveled with his mistress and his wine cellar and his multiple changes of uniform because he needed the external trappings of success to feel like a success. Washington, by contrast, was sleeping in a tent while his soldiers froze at Valley Forge, eating the same inadequate rations, enduring the same hardships. When success came to Washington, it was not a surprise requiring celebration. It was the natural result of having accepted sacrifice as the foundation of everything he was building. Burgoyne's strategic failures at Saratoga could not be separated from his character failures. He had not lost because of bad luck, or because the Americans were necessarily better soldiers. He had lost because he had underestimated an enemy he did not respect. He had lost because he had maintained poor communication with his fellow commanders. He had lost because his supply lines had been stretched too thin, and he had been too proud to acknowledge the problem until it was too late. He had lost because he had traveled with luxuries while his soldiers ate spoiled meat and lacked proper winter clothing. Every one of these failures was a choice. What is particularly striking about Burgoyne's campaign is how much of his intelligence gathering relied on overconfident assumptions rather than verified information. He had been told that loyalists, Americans who remained faithful to the British crown, would flock to his army as he marched south. They would provide supplies, guides, and recruits. The reality was far different. In many regions, the loyalists were outnumbered and frightened. They could not provide what Burgoyne needed. His Indian allies, who he had also counted on heavily, became increasingly unreliable as the campaign progressed. Some abandoned him entirely when they realized the tide was turning against the British. The Battle of Bennington, fought in August of 1777, just 2 months before Saratoga, should have been Burgoyne's final warning. He sent a detachment of roughly 800 soldiers and German mercenaries to seize supplies and horses from the local militia. They were ambushed by American forces under General John Stark, a New Hampshire militia commander. The British detachment was routed. Nearly half of them were killed, wounded, or captured. Burgoyne lost not just soldiers, but, more critically, the supplies he desperately needed. More importantly, he lost the assumption that his professional army would easily defeat the American militia. Stark, a man who had spent decades as a frontier Indian fighter before the Revolution, understood terrain and ambush tactics in a way that formal European military training could not prepare you for. He had told his soldiers, before they engaged, that today there are your enemies, the Redcoats and the Tories. They are ours. Or this night Molly Stark sleeps a widow. It was a rallying cry that worked, because Stark had earned the trust of his men through years of shared danger. His soldiers followed him because they believed in him, not because of his rank or his uniform. This was the chasm that Burgoyne did not understand. The American Revolution was not being fought by soldiers who were motivated by obedience to a distant king and the formality of military discipline. It was being fought by men who understood that they were fighting for their homes, their families, their own survival. That kind of motivation could overcome professional training every single time. Burgoyne never accepted this reality. He never stopped believing that European military superiority would ultimately prevail. That belief cost him everything. The months between Bennington and Saratoga were a slow-motion catastrophe for Burgoyne's campaign. His supply situation deteriorated daily. His army began consuming what little they had captured, and it was never enough. Sickness began spreading through the ranks. Dysentery, typhoid, and other diseases that ravaged armies in the field. The weather grew colder. Burgoyne's decision to push forward despite these mounting problems was not a bold military stroke. It was denial in the form of command. By the time the American army under Gates had positioned itself to block Burgoyne's advance near Saratoga, the British general was fighting an impossible battle against multiple enemies simultaneously. The American army in front of him, the wilderness around him, the dwindling supplies his army depended on, and the mounting despair of his soldiers who could see the situation clearly even if their commander refused to acknowledge it. And still, Burgoyne tried to break through. His order to attack, on September 19th and again on October 7th, were not based on any realistic assessment of his chances. They were the actions of a man who had already invested so much pride in the campaign that he could not accept the possibility of failure. After the second failed assault on October 7th, Burgoyne's army had suffered significant casualties and gained nothing. His officers, including his subordinate commanders, began approaching him privately, telling him that the situation was hopeless. That night, there was a council of war in Burgoyne's tent. Some accounts suggest that he initially resisted the idea of surrendering, believing that he might still find a way to break out and escape to New York. But his senior officers made clear that they would not follow him into another assault. They would not sacrifice the remaining soldiers under their command on the altar of one man's pride. The surrender came the next morning. Burgoyne rode out to meet General Gates under a flag of truce. The two men, professional soldiers from the same military tradition, shook hands. Burgoyne handed over his sword. His army, exhausted and defeated, began the march toward captivity. The British soldiers, many of them conscripts or mercenaries from German states, had no idea that this moment would change not just their lives, but the entire trajectory of the Revolutionary War and the global balance of power itself. What made this moment historically transcendent was not the local victory itself. It was the message it sent to every power in Europe watching the American Revolution with interest. The news traveled slowly across the Atlantic, taking weeks to reach London and Versailles. When it arrived, it was not merely a battle report. It was a declaration that the world order was changing. The British Empire, which had seemed invincible for decades, had lost an entire army to colonials. If that could happen once, it could happen again. If the Americans could defeat a British general under those conditions, perhaps they could actually win the war. This is the exact moment that this script promised to reveal at the beginning. The secret behind Burgoyne's catastrophic failure was not strategy alone or even military competence. It was the collision between a man whose identity was built entirely on unquestioned confidence and a situation that demanded humility, flexibility, and the willingness to listen to contradicting voices. Burgoyne was defeated not by a superior army, but by his own refusal to see reality as it was, rather than as he wanted it to be. When news of Saratoga reached London in December of 1777, it did not arrive as a whisper. It came as a thunderclap that shattered the assumptions upon which an entire empire had built its war strategy. Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for America, had staked his reputation on Burgoyne's campaign. He had approved the plan, he had sent the dispatches. He had told Parliament that the rebellion would be crushed by autumn. Now, in the grey English winter, he had to explain to King George III why nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers had laid down their arms to colonial militia and irregulars led by a man named Gates, a man the British establishment had long dismissed as a mere administrator, certainly no match for a gentleman like Burgoyne. But here's the part that historians have often overlooked. Burgoyne's defeat was not simply a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake that rippled through the colonial world. For months, the Continental Army had been the hunted. Washington's ragged troops were starving. Morale was collapsing. Desertion rates were so high that some regiments were barely at half strength. Soldiers were wrapping rags around their feet because shoes had disintegrated. Officers were pawning personal belongings to buy food for their men because the Continental Congress had no money to send. The revolution, by every rational measure, was dying. And then, in a single afternoon on the Hudson River in New York, everything changed. An American force that was supposed to be beaten, that many thought deserved to be beaten, had stood its ground and shattered the finest general that Britain had sent across the Atlantic. For the first time in the war, Americans had not retreated. They had not surrendered territory and waited for the next blow. They had fought on their own terms, in their own country, against an army that had defeated them repeatedly in the open field. They had won. The psychological effect cascaded through the colonies like nothing before it. In taverns from Massachusetts to Virginia, the news was repeated and celebrated. In militia recruiting offices, volunteers who had been scarce suddenly appeared. Officers who had been contemplating surrender began instead to contemplate continued resistance. And in Europe, in Paris in particular, diplomats who had been watching the American cause with skepticism suddenly saw something they had not seen before, a glimmer of possibility. Before we continue, I need you to keep something crucial in mind. The reason Burgoyne's failure mattered so much is not just that he lost a battle, it is that he lost at a moment when the entire American cause was balanced on a knife's edge. If Saratoga had gone differently, if Burgoyne had broken through to Albany, if he had linked up with Howe, if he had been allowed to split the colonies, the entire trajectory of the war would have changed. The detailed mechanics of how this decision-making chain failed, the specific signals that Burgoyne ignored, the pressure points where a different choice could have altered everything, these are the exact subjects that our complete in-depth guide explores in full. That guide is available in the video description and in the pinned comment below, and it takes you through the intelligence reports Burgoyne dismissed, the warnings he received and ignored, and the precise moments where a commander with even a fraction of humility could have saved the campaign. It is a paid resource, but for anyone serious about understanding how military leaders succeed or fail under pressure, it is worth the investment. Now, the French understood what had happened at Saratoga better than anyone else in the world at that moment. They had been watching the American Revolution with enormous interest, but also with considerable doubt. The French government, particularly Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, the Count of Vergennes, had to answer a fundamental question. Should France commit to an alliance with these ragged colonials, or should they wait to see if Britain would crush the rebellion on its own? An alliance with a losing cause was worse than useless. It would drag France into a global war against the most powerful navy on Earth. And for what? A rebellion that would be crushed anyway? Saratoga answered that question definitively. If the Americans could defeat Burgoyne, then the Americans could potentially win the war. Within weeks of the news reaching France, diplomatic negotiations that had been cautious and vague suddenly became concrete and serious. By February of 1778, less than 4 months after Burgoyne's surrender, France and the United States signed the Treaty of Alliance. France committed to entering the war against Britain, pledging not to make a separate peace, and promising to provide the one thing the American cause desperately needed, a global military rival to Britain that could challenge the Royal Navy and divide British resources. This was the domino that changed everything. Within weeks, Spain began moving toward war against Britain. Within months, the Dutch entered the conflict. What had been an isolated colonial rebellion fighting the world's greatest military power suddenly became a multi-front global war that spread across the Atlantic, into the Caribbean, into the Indian Ocean, and into Europe itself. Britain, for the first time since it had become a global empire, was fighting on too many fronts simultaneously and could not win on all of them. Burgoyne's defeat was the hinge upon which the entire war turned, and Burgoyne himself was present for none of it. He never saw what his failure unleashed. He never understood the cascade of consequences that followed from his refusal to retreat when the situation demanded it. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, eventually exchanged and returned to England, where he spent his final years writing plays and serving in Parliament. His military career was finished. His reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was destroyed in a single autumn. The men under his command paid a different price. Most of the British and German soldiers captured at Saratoga spent years as prisoners of war, held in camps from New York to Virginia, far from home, many of them dying from disease and malnutrition. The Germans, many of them hired soldiers from Hesse and Brunswick, never went home at all. Thousands chose to stay in America after the war ended, settling in New York, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas rather than face the long journey back to Europe. They built farms and small towns. They married American women and raised American children. Burgoyne's ambition had made them refugees in a new world, and they were determined to make the best of it. For George Washington, Saratoga was vindication. He had been criticized relentlessly for his defeats in New York. Congress had received anonymous letters urging his replacement. Officers under his command had questioned his judgment and his ability to lead. After Saratoga, the criticism quieted, not because Washington had won the battle, he was not even there, but because Saratoga proved that American troops could win under the right conditions. It proved that the Continental Army, despite all its shortcomings, was not fundamentally broken. It proved that the American cause was not hopeless, and that belief, that conviction that victory was possible, was what the revolution needed most at that desperate moment. Washington understood something about command that Burgoyne never grasped, that a military leader is not just responsible for winning battles. He is responsible for maintaining the belief in his cause, for keeping his soldiers and his people convinced that victory is possible even when the present circumstances suggest it is not. Burgoyne had the power and the resources. What he lacked was the humility to listen, the flexibility to adapt, and the wisdom to know when confidence becomes recklessness. The contrast could not have been sharper. Burgoyne traveled with personal chefs and wine cellars. Washington ate what his soldiers ate and slept in conditions as harsh as theirs. Burgoyne ignored warning signs and contradicting intelligence because they threatened his narrative of inevitable victory. Washington constantly asked his officers for advice, studied reports carefully, and was willing to change plans if circumstances demanded it. Burgoyne believed the war was already won before the campaign even began. Washington understood that every day of continued resistance was itself a form of victory, because it kept hope alive and made possible the moment when circumstances might finally break in America's favor. This is where the lesson of Burgoyne reaches far beyond the American Revolution and speaks to every moment in history when a leader with power and resources has been defeated not by a superior enemy, but by his own refusal to see the world as it actually is. Burgoyne is not alone in this. Across military history, from ancient times to the present, commanders with every advantage have been undone by the same fatal flaw, the inability to distinguish between confidence and clarity, between the leader they believed themselves to be and the leader the situation actually demanded. The tragedy of Saratoga is not that Burgoyne was defeated. Many generals have been defeated. The tragedy is that he was defeated because he refused to accept the evidence in front of him. His subordinates, his scouts, his own intelligence officers, they all sent warnings. The supplies were not arriving. The local population was not supporting the British cause. The Americans were gathering in larger numbers than expected. The terrain was more difficult than the map suggested. Every single warning sign was there, written in reports and dispatches, waiting to be read by a commander willing to listen. But Burgoyne had already decided what would happen. The rebellion would be crushed. He would be the general who did it. The king and parliament had approved the plan. Lord George Germain had given him command. Therefore, none of the contradicting evidence mattered. The future had already been decided, at least in his mind. All that remained was for events to conform to his expectations. When they refused to, when reality asserted itself in the form of American regiments dug in across multiple defensive positions, when the expected quick victory became an increasingly desperate fight for survival, Burgoyne finally, too late, began to understand what he had refused to see. By then, it was already over. The American forces, under the command of Horatio Gates and the tactical skill of Benedict Arnold, before he became infamous for his later betrayal, had positioned themselves perfectly to exploit Burgoyne's blindness. Every decision Burgoyne made, every assumption he acted on, played directly into American hands. It was as if the Americans knew exactly what he would do, because what he did was exactly what his own vanity and certainty had already decided he would do. The final moments of the campaign, when Burgoyne sat in his tent and contemplated his options, must have been catastrophic for a man of his temperament. Surrender was something that happened to other generals, to lesser men, to those who lacked the confidence and ability that Burgoyne possessed. Yet here he was, with no ammunition, with supply lines cut, with his army surrounded and dwindling daily, facing the choice between continuing a war he could not win or laying down his sword to an American general. The arrogance that had driven him to Canada was still present in those final moments, but it no longer had the power to change reality. Reality had become impossible to deny. And so on October 17, 1777, Burgoyne walked across that muddy field in upstate New York and handed his sword to an American general. 6,000 soldiers, the finest Britain could send, became prisoners of war. The invasion that was supposed to split the colonies and crush the rebellion had instead given the revolution the one thing it needed most: proof that it could win. That sword, the one Burgoyne handed over on that muddy field, told a story that London refused to hear. Because here is the secret I promised you at the beginning of this video, the one that explains why Burgoyne's defeat did more to change the course of the entire war than any battle Washington had won until that moment. It was not simply that he lost a battle. It was that he lost an empire's faith in itself. You see, Burgoyne had promised London something they desperately needed to believe: that this rebellion could be contained, controlled, and crushed by professional soldiers acting with precision. He promised that American volunteers, farmers with muskets, poorly supplied and barely organized, could never stand against trained regulars commanded by a gentleman of his caliber. He promised quick victory. He promised an end to the hemorrhaging of British prestige and treasure. He promised that the empire still worked as it always had. Instead, what Burgoyne delivered was something far more destabilizing to British confidence than any tactical loss. He delivered proof that the assumption itself was broken. That the colonists, those undisciplined rebels, those people the London papers had dismissed as unfit for soldiering, could not only stand their ground against trained soldiers, they could outmaneuver them, outfight them, and force them to surrender. That was the wound that would not heal. In the weeks that followed the surrender, something shifted in the capital. The mood of impatience turned to dread. The assumption of inevitable victory turned to something far more dangerous: uncertainty. And into that crack in British confidence stepped France. Just 5 months after Burgoyne's sword was handed over, King Louis XVI signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. France, the ancient enemy of Britain, the rival that had cost them fortunes and thousands of lives in previous wars, now committed their navy, their army, and their treasury to the American cause. That treaty changed everything. It meant that the war was no longer just a rebellion that Britain could eventually suppress. It meant that Britain now faced a global conflict: France striking in the Caribbean, in Europe, potentially even invading the homeland itself. The Royal Navy could no longer concentrate entirely on blockading the American coast and supporting the army fighting Washington. Suddenly, Britain had to defend an empire across multiple continents while fighting a war they no longer believed they could win as quickly as they had promised. Every problem Burgoyne faced at Saratoga, the distance from supply lines, the hostile terrain, the ability of the Americans to mobilize local militia, became exponentially worse when France entered the war. What had been an insurgency that Britain could theoretically suppress became a legitimate international conflict. And in international conflicts, Britain's enemies could now move openly, trade openly, and receive supplies without fear of being labeled pirates or traitors. Burgoyne's letters from captivity, written after the surrender, show a man slowly grappling with what he had done. He writes of betrayals by subordinates, of the failure of the promised Indian allies to materialize in sufficient numbers, of the way American militia seemed to materialize from nowhere. He complains of the terrain, the weather, the stubborn refusal of his officers to march faster despite increasingly desperate circumstances. What he never quite admits is the simple truth: he overestimated his own brilliance and underestimated his enemy. But here is where the full weight of this man's failure becomes clear, because unlike many defeated generals who could blame circumstances or bad luck, Burgoyne's entire reputation had been built on a single promise: that his genius and his professional competence would overcome any obstacle. He had not come to America to fight an honorable battle and hope for the best. He had come to perform a masterpiece of strategy. He had come to show King George and Lord George Germain and all of London that he understood modern warfare better than anyone else in the empire. He had come to be proved absolutely, conclusively right. Instead, he was proved absolutely, conclusively wrong. And that difference between being a general who loses a battle and being a general whose entire strategic philosophy is revealed as flawed at its foundation, that is the distinction that ruined him. Not just in the eyes of London, but in history itself. When Burgoyne returned to London after his parole, he found himself a political liability. The war continued for 4 more years, but Burgoyne never held a significant command again. He spent the rest of his life trying to rehabilitate his reputation through speeches in Parliament, through writing, through attempting to shift blame onto others. He died in 1792, relatively forgotten, a man whose name had been synonymous with imperial confidence, and who became instead a symbol of imperial arrogance that had overreached itself. The other parts of his failed plan tell their own stories of humiliation and miscalculation. General Howe, commanding in New York, never marched north as promised. Barry St. Leger's force was turned back by local militia near the Mohawk Valley. Burgoyne had counted on their support like he counted on everything else. with absolute certainty that his plan was so brilliant that reality would simply conform to it. When reality refused to cooperate, he had no backup strategy, no flexibility, no capacity to adapt. This is the final irony, and perhaps the truest lesson this story offers us. Burgoyne was not a fool. He was intelligent, articulate, experienced, and capable of genuine tactical insight. What destroyed him was not lack of ability, but excess of certainty. He knew his plan was perfect before he ever saw the ground it would be executed on. He knew the rebels would break before he had fired a shot at them. He knew that professional soldiers would overcome volunteers because he knew, as an article of faith, that the old world of military hierarchy and professional competence always triumphed over the amateur enthusiasm of irregular forces. What he did not know was that the world was changing, that the age of the perfect plan, executed by professional soldiers against peasants who did not know enough to quit, was ending, that a new kind of warfare was emerging, one based on terrain, on logistics, on the ability to move quickly and strike with local knowledge. The American Revolution was not won by continental regulars alone. It was won because Americans could fight like Americans, using their knowledge of their own land, their willingness to take risks, their capacity to improvise and adapt. These were exactly the things that Burgoyne's plan had no room for. The empire that Burgoyne tried to hold together through that invasion, the empire of certainty, hierarchy, and professional supremacy, was already dead. It just did not know it yet. Saratoga was where it found out. Saratoga was where the old world collided with the new world and the old world lost. And the man who embodied that collision, the man whose pride and certainty made the test so absolute, was John Burgoyne. His name faded from popular memory almost immediately. Historians know him, military students know him, but to most of us, he is simply a name attached to a defeat. That is perhaps the deepest wound a man of his ambition could suffer. Not to be remembered as a villain, but to be barely remembered at all. He wanted immortal glory. What he got was a footnote, a cautionary tale about the danger of assuming that yesterday's methods will work against tomorrow's enemies. And yet, and this is the part that makes his story worth telling, worth remembering, worth examining carefully, his failure teaches us something that success never could. It teaches us that certainty itself is a weakness. That the moment we believe our plan cannot fail because we have thought it through thoroughly enough, because we have succeeded before, because we are smarter than our opponents, we have already lost the capacity to see what is actually in front of us. Burgoyne lost at Saratoga, not because he lacked courage or skill, but because he could not imagine being wrong. And in a war fought against an enemy who would not behave according to his assumptions, that blindness was fatal. For leaders today, for commanders, for anyone who must make decisions that affect others, this is the true inheritance of Burgoyne's defeat. The most dangerous general is not the one who is defeated, but the one who cannot imagine defeat. The most dangerous strategy is not the one that fails, but the one that cannot adapt when circumstances change. The most dangerous conviction is not in a cause, but in your own infallibility. Burgoyne brought all three of these to Saratoga, and all three were shattered on that muddy field. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. Burgoyne did not simply lose a battle. He lost because he proved, conclusively and before the watching eyes of the entire empire, that the old order was ending. That the future belonged not to the general who knew everything, but to the one who could adapt to anything. That professional certainty, however refined and however successful in the past, was no shield against an enemy who fought by different rules. And once the empire understood that, once they saw it happen in flesh and blood and gunfire at Saratoga, they could never again believe in the absolute supremacy of their own methods. That understanding reshaped warfare itself. It meant that the future belonged to armies that could move faster, think quicker, and adapt to circumstance rather than rigidly execute a predetermined plan. And ironically, it meant that the British Army, in the centuries that followed, became precisely the kind of adaptive learning organization that Burgoyne could never be. But they learned that lesson at great cost, written in the blood of men like the ones Burgoyne led north from Canada, never to return home. The cost of Burgoyne's arrogance extended far beyond his own reputation or the 6,000 soldiers who became prisoners. It cost Britain the ability to suppress the rebellion quickly. It opened the door to French intervention. It demonstrated to every European power watching that the American colonists were not a temporary problem but a viable military force capable of defeating professional armies. And it accelerated the entire trajectory of American independence by years, perhaps by a decisive margin. So when you think of the American Revolution, when you think of the moment it transformed from an internal rebellion that Britain believed it could suppress, into a genuine threat to British imperial interests, do not think of the elegant victories or the clever tactics. Think of that muddy field in upstate New York. Think of a general who believed so completely in his own righteousness that he could not see the ground beneath his feet. Think of the moment when certainty met reality, and reality won. That is the true legacy of John Burgoyne. Not as a great commander, his record before Saratoga had been solid but unremarkable. Not as a brilliant strategist, his plan, for all its elegance on paper, relied on assumptions that could not survive contact with reality, but as a mirror held up to all of us, reflecting the danger of absolute certainty, the liability of assuming that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow, and the catastrophic fragility of a strategy that depends on never being wrong. Your challenge this week is simple. Examine one decision you are making, one plan you are confident in, and ask yourself honestly whether you are seeing it clearly or seeing only what you believe should be there. Are you listening to information that contradicts your assumptions, or are you filtering it out? Are you building flexibility into your plan, or are you depending on everything going exactly as you have imagined? Because if there is one thing that Burgoyne's defeat teaches us across the centuries, it is this. The world is full of surprises, and the only way to survive them is to hold your convictions lightly enough to adjust them when the evidence demands it. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for honoring these soldiers and this moment that shaped a nation. If you have ever dealt with a leader or a decision-maker whose certainty cost you dearly, I would genuinely love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you found value in understanding how personality and assumption shaped military history, please subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another forgotten hero who deserves to be remembered. Because there are many more of these stories. Stories of arrogance overcome, of courage tested, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible odds. They are waiting for you in the next